Matthews. I'm a professor of religious studies here at Mary Washington, and I'm very glad to welcome you to the first of two lectures this semester, sponsored by the Khatib Program in Religion and Dialogue. The Khatib program was founded by Dr. Reza Khatib, a retired Iranian neurosurgeon who, along with his late wife, Mrs. Georgiana Clifford Khatib, was horrified to watch in New York the events of 9/11. As a response, the Khatibs decided to fund what we have here today, a program that seeks to promote and advance interreligious dialogue among people of different faith traditions. Fortunately for UMW, our retired colleague, Dr. Mehdi Amin-Razavi, happened to meet Dr. Khatib and convince him to locate the program here. At UMW, the Khatib program offers an academic credit-bearing course every academic year. Recent offerings include Religion and Politics in Islam, Religion and Anime, and Ethics and Violence in Religion. Students looking for a course next semester, pay attention, we will have Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner teaching Jesus and Muhammad, the Bible and the Quran. We also have held conferences and, like this evening, sponsored events. Look soon around campus for copies of this book, Following Similar Paths, What American Jews and Muslims Can Learn from One Another, gifts from the Khatib program for students who would like to build bridges right here on campus. Tonight, we are honored to host Dr. Avinoam Pat, the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University. He's also the inaugural director of its Center for the Study of Antisemitism. Dr. Pat is a distinguished scholar in the fields of Holocaust study, anti-Semitism, and the study of the emerging, the emerging field of displaced persons and after the Holocaust study, the aftermath of the Holocaust. He's worked at the University of Connecticut, as well as now at New York University and at the Museum of Jewish Civilization and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His list of publications and appearances is quite lengthy, and in the interest of time, I'd like to highlight just one of his courses, a one-semester course on the work needed to combat anti-Semitism. That course, Why the Jews? Confronting Anti-Semitism, drew over 1,600 students when it was offered. For those of you who do not know, anti-Semitism, the hatred and action against Jews, has existed since the time of ancient Greeks, and it continues to adapt and thrive in various places and eras since then. From microaggressions to pogroms to genocide, anti-Jewish hatred has a terrible cost, not just for Jews, but for all of us who would say we care about humanity. In the Golden Land, the talk for tonight, Dr. Pat has chosen as his topic the notion of the United States as a haven for Jews, and until recently, the consensus that American Jews were living in a so-called golden age. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Avinoam Pat.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to see all of you here this evening, and it's an honor to speak as part of the Khatib lecture series, and I applaud the initiative to facilitate interreligious dialogue and understanding and build communities in conversation. So I'm honored to be here as part of this initiative and of this program. So what I'd like to do this evening, as we talk about this idea of anti-Semitism in the Golden Land, is first of all test a thesis which Professor Matthews just laid out, which is the idea that we can look at Jewish history, the Jewish encounter in America, the Jewish encounter with America, as part of sort of a very optimistic belief in the ability of Jews to establish a largely successful, flourishing civilization here in America, but also test out this question of how we read and interpret this history. And so one of the things we're going to try to understand is, how do we study history? How do we understand history? Do we look at the history of the Jewish encounter with America as one of steady progress, of flourishing, of a small but resilient, very small minority in this country that has been very, very successful, that only recently has encountered anti-Jewish sentiment and has begun to question the question of whether this is sort of the golden land? Or do we look back through this history and see multiple episodes and incidents of anti-Jewish animus which Jews encountered but employed various different strategies to respond to? It's a question of, how do we read and interpret history? Do we take an optimistic view of history, or do we take a pessimistic view of history? And as Professor Matthews alluded to, this lecture that I'm going to give this evening as part of our look at sort of the history of anti-Semitism in America, or the history of the Jewish encounter with anti-Jewish sentiment in America. I actually think it's important that we be careful with the terms that we use. So even though I use this term anti-Semitism in the title, we might even say that it could be anachronistic to use this term anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as was defined for you, sort of a strategy of defining Jews on the basis of certain racial and ethnic stereotypes. The term itself actually has its origins in Germany in the 1870s, when it's first popularized by a group of anti-Semites who are trying to define the Jew as the other, the Jew as a harmful influence that will erode and diminish German civilization. And so they coined this term anti-Semitism to say they are proud to be anti-Semites, proud to be a group that is going to prevent what they see as a harmful Jewish influence from eroding Jewish civilization, German civilization. So as we think about this in the Jewish encounter with America, we can also think about whether it's appropriate to look back through American history and look for anti-Semitism. Say, do we see anti-Semitism in all of these episodes and incidents that I'm going to talk about? Are they the exception, or are they the rule? So what I'll do is take us through a sort of very quick, you can see I did 1654 to the present. That's almost, how many years is that? 350, almost 400 years of history in 40 minutes or so. So I'll try to do my best to cover as much as I can, but I want to highlight certain episodes, and I want us to think about sort of what these episodes represent. Do they cause us to take an optimistic or pessimistic view of the Jewish encounter with America? Now, as was mentioned, let me just make sure that's advancing. This talk, this is actually sort of part of a class that we designed at the University of Connecticut, and now that we also have at NYU. At UConn, we called it Why the Jews Confronting Anti-Semitism. And it was actually a class that was designed in the midst of the pandemic. So already at that time, we had seen a number of anti-Semitic incidents, swastikas that had been graffitied, anti-Semitic graffiti all over different parts of campus that made Jewish students in particular feel very unsettled, very uncomfortable. And so there was a petition that was circulated, and the students asked, can we have a class to teach about what is anti-Semitism? And this was part of a suite of classes that had been developed at UConn that were large-scale, one-credit online classes. One of the first classes was a class that looked at anti-Black racism in America. And we developed this class as actually the third class in this series on Why the Jews Confronting Anti-Semitism. And the challenge was to present the history of anti-Semitism from antiquity to the present in the course of 7 weeks, to provide an introduction to students. And one of the weeks looked at the history of anti-Semitism in America, but we asked this question of, do we take an optimistic or pessimistic view of the nature of the Jewish encounter with America? And of course, if you look at sort of the slide, you can see that in recent years, and in particular since 2016, there has been an alarming rise in anti-Semitic sentiment expressed in various segments across America. And this has been part of a disturbing trend that has seen a rise in anti-Semitism, racism, and extremism, globally around the world with incidents everywhere, even on our campus. And unfortunately, this applies to many, many different campus settings. But as we tried to explain, there's no simple explanation for why this has happened. Antisemitism defies logical explanation, and yet we must try to understand its origins, its history, in order to learn how best to respond to it and to confront it. And what I'm showing you here actually are slides from the period before October 7th, 2023. And so in the aftermath of October 7th, 2023, we've seen even more, right? So all of this is sort of a pattern that we've seen developing in recent years. But again, right, if we think about sort of this pattern that has been developed in recent years, we have to think about this question of, do we see this as the rule or do we see this as the exception? Does this define our interpretation of this history? Or do we look back through history and view it optimistically and see that despite the fact that Jews have been a small minority in this country throughout their history, Jews have done quite well in terms of establishing a flourishing civilization, in terms of carving out a space to observe the Jewish religion or multiple forms of Jewish practice, despite, right, anti-Jewish sentiment. So I want us to think about that as we go through and analyze this. Now, one of the things that I often want to point out at the beginning, for most of my students who are going to be taking a class with me, which usually is a class that either deals with Holocaust studies or the history of anti-Semitism, this will probably be the first and only class that they will take where they will be introduced to Jewish history at all. And so I do it with a certain degree of ambivalence, I should say, about introducing students to Jewish history through the lens of anti-Semitism. Because the broad range of Jewish experience around the globe over thousands of years defies easy categorization. And I would hate for students to learn about Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish religion through the lens of those who have sought to define Jews through hatred of Jews, through those who have tried to use easy stereotypes, different types of stereotypes that identify Jews as harmful, malicious elements in society, and that be the lens with which students learn about Jewish history. And so usually when we teach this, we do a first full week on who are the Jews, what is Jewish history, what is Jewish culture, what is Jewish civilization, what is the Jewish religion from antiquity to the present, how has it evolved, what are the many different forms in which Jews identify themselves, how do we present the idea of Jewish diversity that resists very easy categorization, resists very easy stereotyping. Because, of course, as many different forms of hatred, racism, xenophobia, they attempt to define groups of people according to easy stereotypes. And so one of the first things we have to do is present sort of the complexity. You cannot lump all people together according to certain generalizations, certain stereotypes. There are many ways in which Jews identify themselves that resist this type of easy stereotyping. All right, so that is my preview for this, an introduction. So let's focus on sort of this idea of the golden land story of Jews and the Jewish encounter with America. The way in which Jewish history has largely been taught within the scope of American Jewish history, which, by the way, is a very young field, the field of American Jewish history. The field of American Jewish history has really only taken shape in about the last 30 years. One of the sort of leading figures of the field of American Jewish history, Jonathan Sarna, who teaches at Brandeis University, has an excellent textbook called American Judaism. He tells a story that his father, who was a professor of Bible, Nahum Sarna, when one of his colleagues heard that his son, Jonathan Sarna, was going to go into the field, and he asked him, "What are you going to study?" And he said, "I'm going to study American Jewish history." And the colleague laughed at him and said, "Why would you study that? We know the story. The Jews came to America, they assimilated, they intermarried, and they disappeared, right? There's nothing to study there." And Sarna said, no, I think there is a much more complex story for us to study here about how Jews have moved to this country and done quite well throughout that history. So in general, the way that American Jewish history has been written has minimized the level of anti-Semitism in the Jewish encounter with America. Of course, when compared to anti-Black racism in America, it's difficult to sort of make an argument that it rises to that level, right? There's no comparison. And even more so when you look at sort of the Jewish experience of anti-Semitism in other parts of the world, it's also difficult to make a case that it is comparable to what Jews experienced in Europe. So by those comparisons, it's been a pretty good ride for Jews in America. It's defined in a sort of idea of steady progress. The question, though, which we've seen raised in different theses of late, for example, Franklin Foer, and I'll come back to this article in The Atlantic later, published an article last year called "What Golden Age?" The Golden Age of, or he called it "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending." Now, the thesis was that there once was a golden age, and that golden age has closed. And so I think the question that we have to answer is, first of all, is this affected by the way in which we interpret this history? Has there been a steady history of progress? Or have latent forms of anti-Jewish discrimination always been a core part of the American story, and that American Jews have just successfully navigated these challenges throughout their history? Maybe telling themselves a story about steady progress, steady move to sort of this ideal of the golden age, but it's always been there. So what I'd like us to do is look at several episodes from American Jewish history, and we can think about how we interpret these episodes, right? Do we look at them optimistically or pessimistically? I'm reminded of a joke that I often share with one of my classes, which is a question of what's the difference between a Jewish pessimist and a Jewish optimist? The Jewish pessimist looks at the state of the world and says, things can't possibly get any worse. The Jewish optimist looks and says, oh, yes, they can. So, okay, I'll stick to my day job. So, but it is a question of sort of how do we look at history, optimistically or pessimistically? Sorry, I'm trying to juggle these two screens. All right, crash course in American Jewish history. Jacob Rader Marcus, one of the builders of this field, defined American Jewish history as sort of having four key periods. In a moment, I'll tell you about the early period, the first arrival of Jews in New Amsterdam in 1654, and actually their encounter with the Dutch colonial authorities in 1654. This is our most accurate census for how many Jews were living in America. There were 23 on the boat that first landed in New Amsterdam. But then we can see sort of these different phases of time. The colonial period, I call it the Sephardic period because most of the Jews in this period of time were Spanish Portuguese, sort of descended from Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal. That was the predominant community up until the 1840s. We're talking, as I'll show you in a moment, very, very small sizes. Just a couple thousand Jews throughout the colonies, right? So very small population. The German period means that you have migration of Jews coming from the German-speaking lands, mainly Bavaria, Bohemia, Moravia, some from Prussia, so German-speaking Jews who immigrate to this country in the 19th century. By 1880, 1860, so around the time of the Civil War, there were about 150,000 Jews in the United States, maybe 250,000 by 1880. The East European migration is the period of mass migration, where you have about 2.5 million Jews who come from Eastern Europe to America. But I just want to put this in context. When in 1924, the United States basically closes the gates to mass migration from various parts of Eastern Europe, Southern Europe in particular, they are worried, again, sort of this idea of anti-immigrant sentiment is a constant part of the American story. The Jewish population is roughly around 3 million at that time. That's the high point of Jews as a percentage of the American population, 3%. So Jews are never more than 3% of the American population, right? And today, if we think about where we are today, somewhere between 6 and 7 million Jews in the United States, we can do the math, under 2% of the population, right? So I just want to point that out because folks are often surprised. And by the way, if we look at sort of the global population of Jews in the world today, there are probably somewhere around 15, 16 million Jews in the world, right? So you can do the math on that out of 7 billion. I don't know, I'm not a math major, but it's 0.00 something, very small percentage, right? And folks are often surprised by what a small minority Jews are of the global population. One of my colleagues at the University of Connecticut, who is a sociologist, Arnie Dashevsky, tracks sort of Jewish population growth in America in this way and breaks it down. And you can see the ways in which we're talking about very small numbers of Jews in the early Republic, in the 19th century, what he labels Central European immigration, but then the rapid increase with Jews immigrating from Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century. All right, I will skip ahead here. So let's get to the foundations. So the origin story of sort of the Jewish encounter with America. So as I alluded to, in 1654 is the first Jewish encounter with America. A small boat named the St. Catherine sails into the port of New Amsterdam. And on board the boat are 23 Jews fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition, which has tried to forcibly convert the Jews to Catholicism. In this case, the Portuguese have taken control of part of Brazil and are trying to forcibly convert the Jewish population there. And so this group of Jewish refugees, specifically fleeing Recife in Brazil, flee to New Amsterdam, which is today New York City. And they were in their encounter with New Amsterdam, they meet the Dutch colonial governor of the colony of New Netherlands and of the West Indies Company there, Governor Peter Stuyvesant. And Stuyvesant has no desire to admit these Jewish refugees. He writes to his superiors in the Dutch West India Company and asks them to turn down the requests of the Jewish refugees to be granted refuge in New Amsterdam. He's afraid that this will lead to other religious groups' efforts to enter his colony. He writes to them that he sees the Jews as repugnant and blasphemous rejectors of Christ, right? So this is sort of a very much religiously motivated anti-Jewish sentiment. And he says, please, I want to turn them away. And the Jews, on the other hand, write to their co-religionists in Amsterdam, where there is a sizable Jewish community, some of whom are on the board of the Dutch West India Company, and they ask them to intercede on their behalf to allow them to take refuge in New Amsterdam. And what ends up happening, there's Peter Stuyvesant, is that they write to Peter Stuyvesant, and they say, no, you must admit them. Now, why do they say you must admit them? Well, because it's a colony, and it's a colony where they're trying to promote exchange. It's a port city. They want to engage in trade. And the head of the Dutch West India Company, they say, this can be helpful to facilitate trade and exchange and sort of the commerce that we're trying to facilitate in this port city. And as Stuyvesant had feared, soon other religious minorities also gained entrance into the colony. But in this way, New Amsterdam was typical of a port city. And Jews who arrived and took refuge there benefited from what a port did best, to engage in trade. Economic factors in this circumstance took precedence over everything else, in particular religious discrimination. So again, we can look at this story of the Jewish encounter with Peter Stuyvesant and his sort of anti-Judaism, which manifested as a desire to turn away the Jews as blasphemous rejectors of Christ. And we could say, does this represent the first encounter with the anti-Jewish sentiment? Or does this represent a successful ability to intercede with the colonial authorities in Amsterdam and make a case saying we should be accepted, we should be able to be a religious minority, we should be able to practice our religion in this country? There's Stuyvesant. Right, again, sort of this question of how do we interpret this history? Now, just as I alluded to, I want to show you again, we're talking about, my colleague who runs the National Jewish Data Bank, he says the only accurate survey that we have for the Jewish population is this 1654. We know that there are 23. Everything else after that is just an estimate. But I want to point out to you again, right, if you look at this, so 200 approximately, 200 Jews in the colonies in 1700, 1,000 to 2,500, again, an estimate at the time of the revolution, 0.1%, right? Very, very small minority. What Jonathan Sarna argues, though, is that even though Jews are a very small minority, they do come to have an outside significance as sort of the largest identifiable non-Christian minority at this time. And so even though it becomes sort of a test case for the ideals of the United States, the ideals of this new country that is being established, does this idea of equality, tolerance, democracy, okay, so we're going to say it applies to all Christians in this country, all white Christians in this country at the time of the revolution, do the Jews count? And the Jews become sort of this test case in almost every circumstance. So even though they're a small minority, it's an important test case in this circumstance. So we can see from my next episode here, this test of sort of the idea of tolerance. So we have small minorities of Jews living at this time. Here you can see one example, Abigail Franks, who was a colonial Jewish matriarch, the daughter of a successful New York merchant who has 9 children at this time and is trying to raise a Jewish family as best she can under these circumstances, when again, they're very small Jewish communities. So even the idea of trying to find suitable marriage partners who would be Jewish is a very difficult challenge at this time, which is why also most Jews are not coming from the old world and trying to immigrate to America at this time. There's no community. It's sort of a frontier. There's very little of an organized community. And we have the letters of Abigail Franks, which give us a sense of what it was like to try to raise a Jewish family at this time. And she writes about, for example, one of their daughters, Phila, who runs off with the son of a prominent Episcopalian family, I think from Philadelphia, right? And sort of writes about her heartbreak that this had happened at the time. Another example in the colonial era is the story of Chaim Solomon, who is an immigrant from Poland who came to New York in the 1770s. At the time of the revolution, was in Philadelphia, loaned money to the Continental Congress. Oh, here's the plaque in Philadelphia. He loans money to the Continental Congress without interest. James Madison praises Chaim Solomon for helping the struggling revolutionary cause. And ultimately, he is never reimbursed for his loans to the Continental Congress. And for decades, his family tried to be reimbursed from the federal government for the money that he had loaned to the Continental Congress. And they never get the money back. But they do get this plaque, right? So that's something. The next sort of case that I want to look at is this case of the Newport Jews in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790. So I don't know if anyone has ever been to Newport, Rhode Island or seen the Thoreau Synagogue. So you can see sort of this very interesting structure, which if you look at it, right, so you can see from the outside, this is what the Thoreau Synagogue looks like from the outside. Does it look like a synagogue? No, there's nothing external that would mark or identify it as a synagogue. So this is interesting for us to think about. And I'm going to show you another example from a later period in time, right? This tells us something about sort of the Newport Jewish community, or for that matter, any of the Jewish communities in the colonies at that time, who do not want to signify externally sort of the idea that they are members of a minority faith, that they're part of the Jewish religion. There are no external markers. And yet internally, right, you can see sort of this beautiful structure that is designed in the Sephardic style with the prayer leader sort of standing right in the center. The Torah scrolls will be brought to the center for the weekly reading, and everybody sits around. The women's balcony is in the top. The men sit on the bottom. So beautiful, ornate on the inside, right? But with no markings externally. So this idea of sort of a minority group that appreciates the idea of being able to build a synagogue where they can observe their religion, but does not feel comfortable or able at this time to mark it externally as a house of Jewish worship. So I point that out to you because it's interesting then to see sort of the Newport Jews again, right? So this is a map of Newport, Rhode Island at the time of the Revolution. So most of the Jewish communities, of course, are in port cities at this time. This is where most of the exchange is taking place. And in 1790, so after the Revolution and after the Constitution is adopted in 1787, the Newport Jewish community, represented by its leader Moses Seixas, writes a letter to George Washington, the president, welcoming the newly elected president of the United States on his visit to Newport. And Washington was doing a tour of various cities in the aftermath of the war and then the adoption of the Constitution. It's largely a ceremonial goodwill tour after the Revolutionary War. And Newport historically had been a good home to its Jewish residents who numbered fewer than 500 Jews in Newport at the time. And they were largely well accepted, despite sort of looking at what we look at in terms of what the synagogue looks like in Newport specifically. Congregation, it was called Congregation Kahal Kadosh Yeshuat Yisrael, the Holy Congregation of the Salvation of Israel. So Moses Seixas writes a letter on behalf of the Newport congregation. He describes them as children of the stock of Abraham, expresses their esteem for President Washington, expresses their pleasure in this letter that the God of Israel, who had protected King David, had also protected George Washington, General Washington, and that the spirit which resided in the bosom of Daniel and allowed him to govern over the Babylonian Empire now rested upon Washington. So you see all this sort of biblical allusions, this language that we are living in a moment of sort of great historic significance, and the esteem with which the president is held, being compared to King David in this regard. But then he also expresses the idea that they're living in a time of a great experiment, a government that is erected by the majesty of the people, to which Newport Jewry could look to ensure their, quote, invaluable rights as free citizens. And then he expresses his vision of an American government in terms that will become part of the national lexicon. And here I'll just show you what is in his letter. He writes, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience, immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine, this so ample and extensive federal union, whose basis is philanthropy, mutual confidence, and public virtue, we cannot but acknowledge to be the work of the great God, who ruleth the armies of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, doing whatsoever seemeth to him good. And here you can see the original letter and this important line, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Now, George Washington writes back to the Newport Jews, and here's a copy of the letter that he sends back to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, and he quotes back the letter, the saying from Moses 6 says, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." And he also writes, "It is now no more than toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights." Now, again, if we think about sort of the idea that's being expressed here, that a government that is formed of the people, and the idea that this government should give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, it's quite significant then that we think about how Washington talks about the idea of tolerance, that we're not talking about one group that is a majority group that tolerates a minority group, right? But this ideal that we can aspire to represent all the people. Now, what's quite interesting is that this phrase, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, this is on the side of the National Museum of American Jewish History. It's always quoted from George Washington's letter. But it's quite interesting for us to reflect on the idea that he is intentionally quoting back what the leader of the Newport Jewish community is saying to him, to reaffirm this idea that is being expressed, again, by this small religious minority, asking for protection, essentially, asking that this government will give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And again, if we think about sort of the Naturalization Act of 1790, in the context of the time, it's important for us to understand, right? So the idea that a uniform rule of naturalization enable aliens, any alien being, and it says specifically a free white person, may be admitted to become a citizen. So again, this idea of sort of Jews in America, and one of my colleagues, Eric Goldstein at Emory University, writes about this idea of the price of whiteness, right, which becomes sort of the question about Jews and whiteness in America. What is the cost of this admission, this acceptance, this idea of sort of the American idea of citizenship at this time? But we see, right, so as is expressed in the Constitution, the idea that there should be no religious test, the Establishment Clause, which makes it clear that there should be no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? This sets up sort of a formula that should be sort of a good system for Jews to flourish in this country, right? And so again, I think in the time after the Revolution and in the time of the Constitution, and the adoption of the Constitution, Jews who have come to America feel that on the one hand, there is great opportunity here for religious freedom, for the ability to be protected, to not live in a place where they will suffer from persecution. On the other hand, the challenge is that there is no established Jewish community. So none of the institutions that exist in order to establish sort of a functioning religious society, there are no schools to train rabbis, there are no schools to educate the children, there are no communities with which to find partners for one's children to marry. It's very difficult to raise a Jewish family under these circumstances, right? So those challenges, it's the challenges of living on the frontier. And yet in this, I'm sorry, I'm advancing on my computer, but not here. Sorry, I apologize. Oh, I was talking about the Constitution. Okay, skip ahead. But what we see is the immigrants to America trying to convince their families in Europe to join them. So you can see an example of an early immigrant from Germany who writes to his parents in Bavaria and says, right, how can you continue to live in a place where you cannot even enjoy the simple privileges that correspond to being a human being? Here we are all the same. All religions are honored and respected and have the same rights. An Israelite with talent who does well can, like many others, achieve the highest honors. America, the promised land, the free and glad America has all my heart's desire. Dear parents, if only the Israelites, meaning our fellow Jews, knew how well you can live in this country, no one would really live in Germany any longer. Right? So you can see this idea of someone who has sort of enjoyed the bounties of the possibilities of success, the possibility of economic opportunity, right? Someone who has come from Bavaria, a place where there would be restrictions against Jews entering certain guilds, certain fields, certain professions. They would say these are not open to Jews. Aaron Phillips writing back to his parents saying, how could you stay in a place like this? Come join me here in a place where opportunity abounds, right? And so what we see in this period of what we call the German period is the beginning of a migration that comes from Europe, from the German lands, regeneration, Jews sort of trying to adapt Jewish religious observance to this new land, the beginning of what we will call Reform Judaism, the attempt to reform Jewish religious practice, sort of asking a question of, well, which Jewish laws do we have to keep, do we have to observe? Which ones can we adapt or reform or modify for life in this new land? And there becomes sort of a real divide between America and the way in which religion is practiced, Jewish religion is practiced in America, where the reform movement grows and flourishes and identifies America as a place of progress where you can reform the Jewish religious practice and sort of make Jewish life fit into the modern era. And those who are observers of Orthodox Judaism, strict adherents to Jewish religious law, who say there's no possibility of living on the frontier in a place with no rabbis, in a place where you can't build community, right? So this is this constant tension between how do you build religious life in a place with so much freedom, but without the institutions upon which to build Orthodox religious practice. The typical economic profile of a lot of the immigrants in the German Jewish period is the peddler, right? So it's the time of moving out into the frontier. Someone will take a little bit of capital, buy some products, move from the port cities into the interior, peddle their wares among farming communities in the interior. And this becomes sort of a recognizable Jewish pattern that the peddler is often a Jew who is sort of traveling with their wares on their back, and then they go back to the port city until such time that they've accrued enough that maybe they can open a small store, a general store on the frontier. So a lot of, in this period in the 19th century, a lot of the general stores are opened by Jewish immigrants from Germany who sort of established communities in this way. I'm going to skip ahead. In the period of, again, if we look at another episode from the Civil War, again, we can ask this question of what we can learn from these historic episodes. So on the one hand, it's important to note that at the time of the Civil War, most of the Jewish community, of the approximately 150,000 Jews, lives in the north, in the Union States. But there are some very prominent Jews, like Judah P. Benjamin, who live in the Confederacy. And so Judah P. Benjamin, who's the first acknowledged Jew to be elected to the United States Senate, serves as the senator from Louisiana from 1853 until secession in 1861. And then he serves as a member of the Confederate cabinet. And then eventually after the war and the collapse of the Confederacy, he has to flee to England, where he continues to work as a barrister, right? So again, we can look at this example and sort of say, well, what do we learn from this? What do we take away from this? On the one hand, that you have Jews on both sides, Jews living in the Union, Jews living in the Confederacy, Jews fighting against each other during the Civil War as well, right? So if we think about this, you can't generalize, right? There's sort of the Jews who are living in the different parts of the Union and the Confederacy support the places in which they live. But another of the most famous incidents that we can look at from the period of the Civil War is what comes to be known as General Grant's notorious Order Number 11. And in the context of the Civil War, General Ulysses Grant issues an order blaming Jews for widespread smuggling in Mississippi and Kentucky and bans Jews as a class from Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee. So on the one hand, again, this optimistic, pessimistic view, we could look at this incident and see sort of this is a prime manifestation of sort of the anti-Semitism erupting in a very ugly form in American history. General Grant being convinced that all Jews are responsible for smuggling, which was widespread among these border regions, but identifying Jews specifically. Or we can look at the response to this episode. And the response to this episode is that Jews living in the affected areas protest to Abraham Lincoln immediately. In one case, a Jewish merchant by the name of Cesar Caskel, who lives in Paducah, Kentucky, rushes to the White House, gets an appointment with Abraham Lincoln, meets with Lincoln, tells him about how they've been affected by Order Number 11, and the order is revoked. So again, we have to ask this question, right? How do we interpret this? Do we see General Grant's sort of adoption of this notorious order and focus on that? Or do we see the ability of the Jewish community to advocate on its behalf, to travel to Washington, to have an audience with Father Abraham, right, and sort of who was revered, and that he revokes it, right? How do we interpret this moment in history? And again, this gets to the heart of the dilemma of how we interpret this history. Do we look for the pessimistic or do we look for the optimistic? I will say that for long periods of, this is a map, this is a Yiddish map of the United States. I won't go into translating everything that's on here, but I just wanted to show you, right? Sort of this was a guide for new immigrants of like, what are all the states and what do they look like? But the founder of Reform Judaism in America, Isaac Mayer Wise, who forms the Hebrew Union College, had been a rabbi in Germany who immigrates to the United States in the 1840s and becomes the leader of Reform Judaism, establishes the Hebrew Union College as the first seminary to train rabbis in Cincinnati, Ohio, right? So again, think about like sort of what are the centers of where Reform Judaism is. He sees American Judaism, what he defines as Judaism reformed and reconstructed by the beneficent influence of political liberty and progressive enlightenment, to be the youngest offshoot of the ancient and venerable faith of Israel. It is the American phase of Judaism. And so for him, the idea that Jews should continue to modernize and progress found no better expression than in America, right? So, you know, he would look at sort of the Jewish encounter with America and see this as the ideal place for Jews to experience the reform of their religion in a place that believed in the ideals of progress and opportunity. Nonetheless, as we proceed through the history of this time period, we do see other episodes of sort of these ugly manifestations of anti-Jewish sentiment. One of the most famous cases takes place not long after on the one hand, Isaac Mayer Wise forms the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1875. Joseph Seligman, who had been also a Jewish peddler who had immigrated in the 1830s to Pennsylvania from Bavaria. So again, that profile of the peddler, had started peddling, opens a dry goods store, then he opens a clothing store, then eventually he rises to great prominence on Wall Street as a banker. Very, very affluent, living in New York, had been an advisor to President Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes. He was offered to join Grant's cabinet, which he turned down, right? The same Grant of Order Number 11, right? So think about how we interpret this history. So he decides to go on vacation up to Saratoga Springs in New York, and he goes to visit the Grand Union Hotel in 1877, and he's turned away. Right, so one of the most affluent, prominent figures, sort of a leader of the Jewish community, is turned away. And it is because Judge Henry Hilton, who had taken over the Grand Union Hotel in 1876, decided to stop admitting Jews into his hotel. He decided that, so the story goes that, and it was reported in the New York Times at the time, Seligman is astonished that he's being turned away, a place that he had actually been able to stay before. And he says, "Do you mean to tell me that you will not entertain Jewish people?" "That is our orders, sir," was the reply. Seligman was unsatisfied. "Are they dirty? Do they misbehave themselves? Have they refused to pay their bills?" "Oh, no," replies the manager of the hotel. "There is no fault to be found in that respect. The reason is simply this. Business at the hotel was not good last season, and we had a large number of Jews here. Mr. Hilton came to the conclusion that Christians did not like their company, and for that reason shunned the hotel. He resolved to run the union on a different principle this season and gave us instructions to admit no Jews." So again, this is an incident where we think about how do we interpret this moment in history, right? The idea of Hilton sort of saying we're not going to allow any Jews, Christian clientele saying we don't want to stay in a hotel where Jews are staying, right? Seligman representing somebody who's done extremely well, risen to the highest levels of prominence on political levels, economically, been a remarkably successful story, going literally rags to riches story, and yet continuing to encounter anti-Jewish sentiment, right? What do we take away from this? Do we see anti-Semitism always there, or do we see it as something that manifests at different points in time? And this, I will say, this episode takes place at a time that is right before we begin to see large-scale migration of Jews coming to America from Eastern Europe. And we also begin to see at this period of time great debate about America's openness to immigration at this time. So as I mentioned before, 1881 in particular is a turning point. Between 1881 and 1914, so between that period of time, the assassination of the Tsar Alexander II and the outbreak of large-scale pogroms in Eastern Europe and the beginning of the First World War, 2 million Jews leave the Russian Empire and come to New York. A large majority of them settling in New York City, something like 75% go to New York. The Lower East Side becomes New York becomes the largest Jewish metropolis in the world, something like 500,000 Jews living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, below Houston Street. And it's a very rich collection of Jews who've come from all over Eastern Europe in particular, establishing sort of a vibrant culture, but also it's a difficult life, living in the tenements of the Lower East Side, living in extreme overcrowding, housing that is not suitable, horrible hygienic conditions. And this gives rise to, again, a great debate about migration and whether the United States should be open to all of these immigrants. And what I'll say in this time period, and here you can see sort of this idea of the Great Migration that takes place from 1881 to 1920, the rise in the Jewish population to 3.5 million, that's 3.3% of the total population. In this context, it's interesting to think about a voice that enters into this debate about what America's policy should be about admitting large numbers of immigrants. And that's actually the voice of the poet Emma Lazarus. Because in 1883, she is asked to write a sonnet, she writes a poem, as part of a fundraiser for this gift that the United States has received from France to celebrate its 100th anniversary. The French give us this Lady Liberty enlightening the world, but of course meaning the United States, no place to put it. And it's sitting in sort of broken apart pieces, and there is no pedestal. And so there's a fundraiser to erect a pedestal to find a place to put the statue. And Emma Lazarus, who is a descendant of those same Newport Jews, has a prominent position, is a writer, has studied with some of the great poets in America at the time. She writes this poem as a fundraiser. And this poem, which becomes emblazoned on the pedestal of the statue, is sort of a great plea for accepting immigrants, right? The idea that the statue, what does she say? This mother of exiles. She says, keep ancient lands, your storied pomp. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Now, this, she writes in 1883, it takes actually 20 years for it to be put on the pedestal of the statue. It takes a long time for them to fundraise in order to put the statue. But what's amazing is that this idea of the statue symbolizing an openness and a welcome to immigration is not necessarily what the statue had to represent, but it does become what the statue represents. And it's very much sort of associated with this poem by Emma Lazarus saying we have to, as a country, be open to immigration. But of course, this is part of an intense debate that's taking place in this period in time. The idea, you can see her expressed in Judge magazine in 1892, their New Jerusalem. This is anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant sentiment, that Jews are sort of overrunning the country, bringing their kind, eroding the idea of what it means to be American. Here you can see another example of this. The stranger at the gate, Uncle Sam holding his nose, while the Jewish peddler, the Jewish immigrant, brings with him disease and poverty and Sabbath desecration and anarchy and whatever else, right? So again, we can see sort of these ideas flaring up at different points in history. And we can also see the responses to them flaring up at different points in history. I'm going to skip ahead because I just want to get to a couple of other cases. Most famously is the case of Leo Frank and the lynching of Leo Frank. And this, again, if we think about this period of time, we see that Leo Frank had been convicted of murdering Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old employee of an Atlanta pencil factory. And there's a trial where evidence that is introduced, it makes it clear that he is being railroaded. I'll just skip ahead. What's interesting about this period in time is that we see in the case of Leo Frank, this is also the time where the Anti-Defamation League comes into existence. An idea that in this case, represented by Leo Frank, the idea that he did not commit this crime, but because he's Jewish is being prosecuted for this crime. Eventually, Leo Frank, even though the governor begins to have doubts about his conviction, the murder conviction, he is taken from the prison not far from Atlanta and lynched in 1915 by a group calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, which is essentially the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. And what we see in this period of time in the case of Leo Frank is the emergence of, again, this sort of very deep, dark, anti-Semitic influence that is being expressed in the American context. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, which have begun to spread from the Russian Empire, which allege that there is some Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, that there's a cabal of Jews who sit around the table bent on world domination, and have introduced all of these sort of political movements like communism to destroy capitalism, for example. It's all part of a Jewish world conspiracy. We can see this expressed through the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this forgery, this myth of the protocols is debunked numerous times, and yet it has a remarkable afterlife that continues. and perhaps the most famous sort of proponent of the protocols in the American context is Henry Ford, who, the wealthiest industrialist of his time, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, who basically takes his fortune to start his international weekly, the Dearborn Independent, and over the course of years and years continues to rail against the Jews and specifically publish the ideas of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his Dearborn Independent. He's anti-immigrant, anti-labor, anti-liquor, and above all, anti-Semitic. And he believes that there is a Jewish world conspiracy. And various efforts are made to get him to stop, but what's ultimately successful are legal strategies to get him to stop. He is accused, he defames a Jewish labor organizer by the name of Aaron Sapiro. Sapiro sues Henry Ford for libel. Ford refuses to testify at the trial. Eventually there's a mistrial, and Ford ultimately settles out of court and stops publishing the newspaper. But there is a connection between Henry Ford, what becomes the Nazi movement in Germany, and the emergence of the KKK in the United States as well. So the question is, do we look at this incident, again, in a pessimistic light as evidence of sort of these deepest, darkest undercurrents of anti-Jewish hate which exist in America? Or do we look at it as the successful ability of the American Jewish community to use the legal system to force Ford to stop publishing this, right, to counter it? And, again, we can interpret this history in both directions. I'll just end with sort of getting to the Second World War as my final example of looking at sort of how this affects the Jewish encounter with America, and say that, again, in 1924, the United States stops immigration from Europe largely to America. When Hitler and the Nazis come to power in 1933, and there is a Jewish refugee crisis in Germany, it is a period in time where the Jewish community in Germany, and then eventually throughout Europe, needs America as a refuge. But essentially, there is a great deal of anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic sentiment being spread through large parts of the American public, including, for example, by the prominent radio preacher, Father Charles Coughlin, who is quite anti-Semitic, quite anti-immigrant, and sort of like Ford believes that Jews are behind a conspiracy to undermine Christian civilization. And what's important for us to understand is this helps us, the popularity of these ideas helps us to understand also the American response to the rise of the Nazi Party and the growing refugee crisis in Germany. So, for example, after the Kristallnacht pogroms in November of 1938, which are widely reported in the American press, it's not a situation where people don't know what's happening. On the night of the broken glass, November 9th and 10th, 1938, over 100 Jews are killed throughout Germany. Hundreds of synagogues are destroyed. Thousands of Jewish apartments, businesses are ransacked and destroyed. 25 to 30,000 Jews are arrested and taken to concentration camps. And you can see this is polling taken at the time. Do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? 94% disapprove. So they know and they disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany. Should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? 71%? No. Right? So again, we can think about sort of that disconnect. I think what's important for us to understand in this context is how this then influences American policy. It is deeply unpopular politically for the United States to take in any refugees. The perfect manifestation of this is the tragedy of the St. Louis, which is a boat of Jewish refugees that thinks that they have visas to enter America in May of 1939. They sail for over 2 weeks. They think they have visas to enter Cuba. They sail for over 2 weeks. They reach Havana Harbor in Cuba. They're told that their visas are forged, even though they've paid large amounts of money to get these visas, and they are forced to turn back. They intercede with the State Department, ask for an exception to be able to dock in Miami because they're in Havana. Can they, this boat of 900 Jewish refugees? And the State Department says absolutely not. They're worried that if they allow one boat in, there's going to be lots of boats of Jewish refugees who come in. But this, if we understand sort of the degree of anti-immigrant sentiment that is pervasive in America at the time, the idea that Americans do not want to get involved in the war effort at the time, we can understand sort of the responses to Nazi persecution of Jews. And we can also see the popularity of certain movements and certain ideals in America at this time, including, for example, the idea of the Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in 1939. The question is, do we focus on the rally inside the garden, or do we focus on the thousands of people protesting the rally outside the garden, right? Again, sort of this dilemma of how we interpret the history. I will just say, and I'm not going to focus on it now, but in my class, I have the students watch the film Gentleman's Agreement, which I don't know how many people have seen Gentleman's Agreement. 1947, Gregory Peck, definitely worth seeing. Peck, this is 1947, this is post-war America. It's a movie about anti-Semitism. Gregory Peck goes undercover as a Jew to expose sort of the harmful elements of anti-Semitism in American society, what we think of as polite social anti-Semitism. And so in an episode that we can see taken directly from the Seligman encounter at the Grand Union Hotel, he goes into a hotel, he says, my name is Phil Green, and the guy asks him, are you Jewish? And he says, yes. And he says, well, we have no rooms for you. Right? And so then he writes this whole sort of story of the encounter, but it's almost told in a sense of educating an American public after the Second World War of the dangers, the harm of anti-Jewish sentiment. But again, and I'll just wrap up with this, we can see sort of throughout American history these sort of countervailing forces, right? And what the Jews represent in this encounter, even in the context of trying to keep America out of the Second World War, trying to prevent America from entering the war, and then sort of the idea of America entering the war too late to do anything to save European Jewry. So what's interesting, and I'll end with this, is the ways in which American Jews then navigate the post-World War II era. And again, we do see sort of American Jews celebrating the idea of becoming American, of being a core part of the Judeo-Christian idea, of celebrating this sort of successful encounter with America, celebrating 300 years of Jewish life in America, of being accepted. And yet it's always a tenuous acceptance. There are always these stories like of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg where we have to ask, right? Why was Ethel Rosenberg executed for treason? What was happening there? Was there anti-Semitism at play in this episode? And yet at the same time, we see in the post-World War II era, Jews building synagogues like this, which you can compare to the Touro synagogue, celebrating the ideal of acceptance, the ideal of sort of having these grand structures where they proudly pronounce who they are, right? Their arrival in the American suburbs. And this sort of ambivalence of this encounter with America, right? The idea of being accepted, but as Woody Allen says in Annie Hall, you know, sort of the ambivalence of, I'm not sure I would want to belong to any club that would have someone like me as a member, right? Questioning whether it's real, whether one has really been accepted. So I'll just skip ahead here because I've gone a little bit over, but I'm happy to talk about our contemporary moment in the context of what we've looked at and ask this question of, the golden age, as Franklin Foer poses it, right? Has the golden age come to an end? Has, as he writes, an era of acceptance and achievement, is it in danger, right? Jews who are experiencing hatred and anti-Semitism, both from the right and the left, what does it signify, right? Does it signify the end of an era? Was there ever a golden age? Were we reading the history wrong? Or are we underestimating the ability of a minority group that has been able to find a great deal of success in American society? Are we underestimating the ability of that group to form alliances with other minority groups and continue to support the idea that America should be a place which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance? Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions and answers, so I have placed strategically people with microphones.
Hi, thank you. To what extent was early American anti-Semitism influenced by English anti-Semitism, since most American culture was initially English culture when they came over in the 1650s?
Yeah, good, very good question. To what extent was it influenced by English, sort of, or let's say old world, kind of the idea of anti-Jewish sentiment? And so one of the things that I think is important, and it's an important question in terms of how we interpret this, are we seeing it as, let's say, Christian anti-Judaism, right? So old world ideals that are continuing to be expressed in terms of anti-Judaism that is brought from Europe. Yes, there is to a certain extent that sort of the ideas of the Jews have not accepted Christ. Jews will not be able to achieve salvation. And what I will say is that, yes, there's a part of it that's connected to England, but also there's a part of it that's connected to movements that are authentically American, right? So if we think about the religious revivals that take place in the United States at different periods of time, for example, in the 19th century, in the 1820s, and again in other periods of time, there is a correlation that we can see there between these like religious revival movements and then the Jews representing a group. Well, what will happen to them, right, if they don't accept Christ? Are they doomed to have eternal damnation? What I'll say, though, is interesting in sort of thinking about what makes it American is, and why this can be different, is as we've seen throughout sort of different periods of this time, opposition to Jews, especially later in the 19th century, that is connected to anti-immigrant sentiment. And so in as much as Jews become symbols of outsiders, of immigrants, anti-Semitism connected to xenophobia, this idea of what one can define as authentically American and the Jew being other. So there are parts of that that are then uniquely American in the ways that it's connected to anti-immigrant sentiment and the ways that sort of Jews represent that. And yet there's other parts of it that we can see sort of functioning. So as I mentioned, in Germany in the 1870s, the origins of the term anti-Semitism also is connected to this idea of the Jew being the outsider, the Jew being other, the Jew being an undesirable immigrant. So there are similarities, but there are also differences that make it uniquely American.
Yes, do you know of anything being done about this movement of darker-skinned black men calling themselves Egyptians that are still wanting to enslave Jewish people?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. It's not something that I've studied a lot, to be honest with you. But there are these different movements, like Black Hebrews or different groups that we see sort of the expressions of anti-Semitic ideas sometimes being expressed in these movements. But it's not something that I can say I've studied extensively.
Other questions? Oh.
So on that earlier graph that you had at the very beginning, you're showing sort of increasing anti-Semitism in recent years. It was at the very beginning.
Oh, okay.
And what I'm wondering is, and I just checked the date, I think in 2016, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was articulated and stated, and then over time,
I'll go
It's
to
been-
that definition. Yeah, go ahead.
it's been adopted by some players, not all players, and I guess that's it, right? And I guess what I'm wondering is how much of the increase might be attributable to that redefinition? And I just want to hear what you're thinking about that.
Yeah. So, and I apologize that I didn't sort of get to the later part, but I'm glad you bring up some of these more contemporary questions. So just this IRA, so the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism, which has become politicized in a lot of ways, right? Sort of a lot of pressure to adopt this definition. Let me just read the definition. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. I don't think it's a very good definition. Just in terms of a certain perception of Jews, like there are various other definitions that have been employed that are, I think, much more clear. What distinguishes this definition, and what I don't have enumerated here, but is sort of explained in the next paragraph, is the question of when does criticism of Israel come to be defined as quote unquote anti-Semitic. And that's why a lot of people want to support the IRA definition. And that's where most of the debate about this definition comes in, sort of the questions of what types of criticism, when does criticism of Israel become across the line into anti-Semitism. There are points which a lot of different groups from across the political spectrum agree. So holding all Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, or demonizing Israel using Nazi symbols, right? Like those are things that are clear, but then there's some things that are not clear. What I'll say though, I think it doesn't necessarily have to do with the IRA definition. I think, and you know what, it is worth going back, well, I don't know, it's like 100 slides, but the charts that I showed in the beginning, so for example, the Anti-Defamation League, I'll just show you this. So the Anti-Defamation League, which we talked about in the context of the Leo Frank case and its forming in 1913, right, has something called its heat map. And you can see on the heat map that they chronicle sort of incidents of extremism or anti-Semitism. And so the question is, what gets counted? So on the one hand, extremist murders. Okay, so Pittsburgh, for example, this is a very clear case of extreme anti-Jewish violence that we see in Pittsburgh in October of 2018. The murder of 11 Jews in the synagogue there. But the question is then what else gets counted, how we define this. And so if you're counting, for example, comments on social media sites. So yes, on the one hand, that is a manifestation of anti-Semitic sentiment, but we can count lots and lots of things, right? So what I think is quite important for us is to drill down and be very specific in terms of the categories that we're talking about, right? There's physical violence. Obviously, there's what they count here as extremist murder. There's white supremacist propaganda. And then there's different forms of incidents. And so when I look at those charts, what I want to know is when we drill down, what are we actually looking at? Not to minimize it, but to be specific in the ways in which we study it and what are we counting. And I'll tell you why I think it's important to be specific, because I think we have to develop different strategies for different types of phenomena, right? So, if we're talking about hate speech on social media, for example, which is a very, very real problem that we're all familiar with. Well, I think there are very different strategies that we can develop for how to counter hate speech on social media that hopefully someday, I don't know if it'll happen in terms of getting companies to, effectively regulate the type of hatred that is spread on these platforms. Maybe that ship has sailed. I'm not sure. Maybe someday we'll be able to have effective regulation. But that's a different strategy, I think, than sort of having armed guards outside of a synagogue because we're worried that some armed extremist is going to take it over, right? So it's quite important then to distinguish like the types of strategies we have to develop to respond to different threats. And anyway, I could go on, but I'm glad that you sort of ask for that specificity because I think it does matter.
So you mentioned about the religious reasons and anti-immigration reasons behind anti-Semitism in earlier times. What do you think that it has continued, or perhaps I don't know the exact data, but increased in the last decade or last few years? What is the reason, the root causes now against anti-Semitism? And other than the Jewish community's efforts at the political level, kind of some of them you mentioned, what have they historically done or today doing to remove the misconceptions about Jews or remove that ignorance at the grassroots level?
Yeah. So two very good questions. One is sort of the question about anti-immigrant sentiment, which now, as we have seen, is a sort of constant recurring motif in American history, right? So I showed you sort of examples from the 1880s and again from the 1920s, and we can look at sort of subsequent periods of time where we see anti-immigrant sentiment, including our current moment. So this is sort of this recurring motif, and I think one of the things that we can see in terms of the correlations between anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant sentiment, I mean, there's usually a great deal of connection between when these emerge. So you asked about most recently. And it's quite interesting to think about sort of historically, when do we see anti-Semitism emerge? So we do see it in times of great economic crisis and unrest. We are living through a time of immense economic transformation right now, right? There's a great deal of economic uncertainty. We have new technologies that have emerged. We have sort of uncertainty of what the path forward is. We have lots of people who feel displaced economically, right? So there's a lot of anxiety, and then there's an ability to tap into that, I think, using, again, xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism. I think in a lot of cases, it's closely connected. Most recently, right, we see it being mobilized and used as an effective political tool. Again, in a global way, right? So what we're seeing here now is sort of, and this is again where it's tricky to look at this in a transnational sense. I'm on the one hand saying, yes, there are unique American components, but it's also very much connected to other movements that we're seeing globally in different parts of the world, right? So Hungary, I think, is a really interesting example, right? Where you have sort of mobilization of populism, proto-fascist ideas, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-George Soros is like an important motif in Hungary. And we can actually trace direct connections between some of the Hungarian anti-Semitic ideas that are adopted here. But at the same time, we can see how it's utilized both specifically about Jews, but then also more generally about sort of an anti-immigrant idea, about distress, sort of economic unrest, displacement, political uncertainty, all of those phenomena coming together. And absolutely, since 2016, we've seen it sort of platformed on a higher political level. We've seen it sort of lead to success politically, right? This coincides with social media, the spread of hate speech on digital platforms, an inability to regulate it in any way, social media that sort of thrives off of sort of hate extremism. It's a platform that drives people to more extremes based on sort of how the algorithm functions, right? So, so we have this melange of a lot of different factors coming to play right now, politically, economically, technologically. And it's interesting because usually when you have new technologies that are developed, you can also see them being effectively mobilized to spread hate. So, from the time of the printing press, we can see the blood libel, right? So you have the blood libel in the Middle Ages, but it wasn't sort of very well spread. Then you have books, and all of a sudden everybody knows about the idea that Jews murder Christian children for their rituals. Or, radio. All of a sudden we have preachers sort of using the radio to spread and spew anti-Semitic ideas, or newspapers, or television, or now social media. So again, we can see sort of how technology plays a part in that. To the question about strategies, I think, and this is where I'm very concerned about sort of what's happening in the present moment, I said how anti-Semitism is used as a political tool. I think Jewish organizations in this country just have to be very careful about sort of the idea of anti-Semitism, and I'm not putting quotation marks to minimize manifestations of it. I'm putting quotation marks to say that sometimes it's used for political purposes. So, okay, I'm on a college campus right now. I think that, what's happening right now is it's being used as a political tool to attack higher education. And so this is, again, you have to be very careful about sort of it being used and adopted for political purposes. Historically, Jews do not do well under extreme political circumstances. Moderation, democracy, sort of free and open exchange of ideas, that's a better recipe for success, which means that I think Jews would be better served by forming alliances with other groups and thinking about sort of the connections between anti-Semitism and many different forms of hate, and then how to create a society in which sort of, again, bigotry, no sanction, persecution, no assistance.
Wonderful. Well, please join me again in thanking our speaker, and mark your calendars for Wednesday, April 9th, when Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner will be speaking on Islamophobia. Thank you, Dr. Pott.
Thank you.